Hello everyone, and welcome to the SurfaceFX module. In this module, I'll be talking about the why, the what, and the how of SurfaceFX. So I figured we could start off with the why, shown through some examples. Our first example here is taking a look at this piece of candy, and I want to make sure that there are no tears or anything else like that in the packaging itself. Now under normal lighting we can somewhat see the tears. We might be able to use a blob tool to highlight those, but with SurfaceFX what it can do is it can highlight the surface defects that really aren't apparent using the typical machine vision lighting we saw before. Now we can use a blob tool to easily pinpoint those tears in that candy. Here's another example. So if we take a look at this, we have some dot-peened characters on a piece of metal. So what SurfaceFX can do is it can extract those indentions and make them a bit clearer. And also, if you notice on this, there's a little bit of noise in the background. You see a little bit of red. It's also on a curved surface, and that makes it a bit difficult to see. You can play around with the light a little bit to minimize that glare, but when we bring things into OCR, for example, we really want a nice uniform background. It just makes the tool run more robust. So if you take a look at SurfaceFX can do for you is it will make that nice contrast from the back to the fonts themselves, and it will remove any of that the background glare and also the background noise. Similar, we're going to take a look at this where we have some raised characters. Actually, these are indented characters of the same color on this piece of metal. And again, with SurfaceFX, it really brings out those characters really nicely, so it makes OCR run very, very well. And again, another example here, we have some characters on another piece. This looks like a piece of wood, and you can see there's quite a bit of background noise there. And if we tried to run OCR on this now, it would have some problems with the 2 and also the 0 that you see here as well, and the 4 and the 6. But if we run SurfaceFX on this, it's really going to bring out those numbers and make it easier to use and read. Another example. Again, very noisy background, lots of different things going on here. But with SurfaceFX, what we can do is really bring out those characters to make it easier to read, and also make it easier to read that data matrix code as well. Here's another example. Now this looks pretty good, I think, with just the south bank light on. I bet you with all on, it would probably look pretty good. It might work for you. But this is what SurfaceFX can do for you. It can really give you the contrast of that chip on that card. So if this is really what you need to concentrate on, SurfaceFX might be the better choice here. Here's some additional examples to highlight some surface defects that are not apparent using regular lighting. As you can see, the defect is right here circled in the red, and it really shows out on the SurfaceFX image. Again, there is a scratch, and then we can really see that scratch there. And our final two examples here, again, we have some things that are etched in metal, and they show up really well with SurfaceFX. And one thing to note is that when things are etched, they turn out black, or they're represented as black, and if they are raised, they turn out white. And if you see our example down here, we have a sticker on a pad. You can't really see the edges there, but with SurfaceFX it does bring them quite a bit more out, so you can continue on with your inspection. Now, looking at those examples, I think it's clear that we know why you would use it. Number one, you can use it to showcase small surface defects, as we saw with that piece of candy, or I'm sure you've seen other examples with the creamer top with a hole in it. We really want to highlight those chips, the dents, the wrinkles, the punctures, the tears, things that really aren't seen with normal lighting. SurfaceFX will be able to bring out for you. Another thing it does is it will add contrast to where there was none. So if you have the same color on the same color features, like a red on red, maybe it's a red on red engraved or embossed, stamped, etched, raised feature, it's sometimes hard to bring out that contrast using normal lighting. So if you take a look at this example here, we have the bottom of a shampoo. We can see the black printed characters on top, but there's some things underneath that I wouldn't be able to see or bring up using normal lighting. But with SurfaceFX, what that can do is that can bring up any of those features that are raised, as I said, or embossed, and really make them shine. So now you can do your OCR read on the black code that you see on the first image, but you can also run SurfaceFX and use this image for some other inspections that you have. And one of the examples we saw was that SurfaceFX will remove the background light noise. So if you do have a glare, or if you have a bunch of other stuff going on, like the red marks we saw on the side of that cylinder, SurfaceFX will remove that and just really show you anything, again, that is stamped that is below the surface or above the surface, and really bring out that contrast for you so you can run your tools on this. Now, one thing we have found with SurfaceFX is it doesn't work on glass or anything without reflection, and that's just the nature of the algorithm underneath SurfaceFX. It really needs the images to generate some, shadowing. It needs some reflections. So if you have something that basically absorbs all that light and doesn't send anything back to the camera, it's not going to work. So if the transmission is really, really loose, you're not going to be able to see anything. Another thing to note is that we have seen that on some extremely shiny surfaces, like extremely shiny plastic surfaces, sometimes we'll see those hot spots, and I do know that SurfaceFX will sometimes struggle with that. So we just need to be aware of these things that we know that SurfaceFX kind of doesn't work with, and we might need a different solution. So now that we saw some examples of SurfaceFX and why we would use SurfaceFX, let's really talk about what exactly is it, or what does it use underneath the hood. So underneath the hood, it actually uses an algorithm called photometric stereo, and it's an algorithm that's been around for a while. In fact, you can Google this and you can see there are many, many papers on it. But the basis of this algorithm, it really needs low angle directional lighting in order to get those reflections and those shadows, and it will make a topography of the surface. So it will show you what's going on the surface just by the low angle lighting. So you can see from my graph here, or not my graph, my diagram here, number one, you need something to capture that, and then you need some nice low angle lighting around there to generate some images for you. Now, the photometric stereo algorithm I've seen has 3, has 4, has 8. There's a bunch of different permutations of this algorithm. But for SurfaceFX, we actually require 4 directional low angle lights in order to get us those reflections, in order to create those shadows of any of the features that are indented or raised. And so once we get those 4 images, and as you can see I have 4 images down here on the bottom, we take those and we're going to combine those and we're going to send those to SurfaceFX, which combines them and runs that wonderful algorithm and really creates this wonderful topography of the surface. And as you can see, raised features are white, and lower features are features that are below the surface are going to wind up black. But it really just brings forth those features for you so you can run your tools on this image after the fact. So SurfaceFX is introduced with Insight Explorer 5.4. In fact, it runs on all the next generation models. So that would be the next generation 7000, 8000, and also the 5705. Now, we did have this out in beta before, and some people were able to get a sneak peek of this, but this is officially released in 5.4. And as we saw from my diagram before, you need a camera, you need lights, and you also need a way to control those lights, because we want this to be directional. And if I pop back here, right there, you'll see I have 4 images here. Each image is captured with only one light on. So you can see it's on the left, it's on the top, it's on the bottom, it's on the right. So we need some way to control that. So there's a variety of ways we can do that, but first let's take a look at the light. Let's start with the integrated light. Now, the 7000 has an integrated light. It does have bank control, and this is a diffuse on-axis light, but some of those light properties or some of those rays actually come in at a low angle. So when this is about 3 to 5 inches from your part, it actually can generate some nice shadowing and some nice reflections, which is what SurfaceFX needs. And the beauty thing with this is it doesn't need an external control box. It doesn't need an external I/O. It is self-contained, all-in-one. It's a fantastic demo. It's a great demo to use to show customers this is what SurfaceFX does. This is why you would use this technique. Now, in terms of real-world application, keep in mind the following, that it is a small field of view. If you take a look at the light itself, SurfaceFX would have a region of maybe 1 to 2 inches. So it's a smaller solution. I don't know how many customers would actually want to use a small solution. A lot of the SurfaceFX applications I've seen are much larger. The other thing to understand is that it's not a true low angle light. This is a diffuse on axis light, and some of those diffuse properties will scatter those light rays nice and low, and that's how we get SurfaceFX to look so nice with this product. But just wanted to put that out there, that you can use the integrated light, but I really see the applications using an external light. So the external lights would be maybe an Insight with a quadrant controlled light, like the CCS quadrant controlled light. It turns on each quadrant in unison, or in succession, excuse me. Another one would be a light from different bar lights, and there's so many of those out there. CCS, OPT, SVL, a lot of different bar lights are out there, and you can take those and put those together in a bracket, or you construct your own bracket. So the amount of external lights out there is, the sky's the limit. But basically, what do we need? We need a nice low angle light from different quadrants. I mean, that's what you need. That's what we need to make, okay? Now you have the lights, you have the camera, you have the algorithm, but you know we need to somehow turn on each light and capture an image with that. So we need some control. So with that, what we can do is we can have an Insight controlled with discrete I/O. So we'll control the light with the discrete I/O. So that could be, for example, the 7802 has 2 built-in high-speed outputs and has 2 bidirectional outputs, and we can make those all outputs. So now you have 4 outputs to control 4 lights. So you can have Insight control all these lights, or you can use an I/O module, the CIO Micro, or the 1400 again. That's going to give you 4 discrete outputs to control for the light. So Insight will turn on the light and acquire, turn on the light and acquire, turn on the light and acquire. So you're going to get those 4 lights, or excuse me, those 4 images that you need for SurfaceFX to work its magic. Now, if that doesn't work for you, you always have the option of using an external controller. So with CCS, they have an external controller that is linked with their ring light that is segmented. So CCS will control the light, and it will turn on the light and also trigger Insight as well. Now, you're not limited to CCS. Other lighting manufacturers have these controllers. I know SVL is working on them. I know OPT has a controller that controls their lights as well. So there's a lot more light controller modules out there than just CCS. And also don't forget about Gardasoft. I mean, that's what they do, is they control lights. And also I wanted to mention the PLC. A lot of lines have PLCs on there. So you can use the PLC to turn on and off lights and also trigger Insight as well. So really what you need to do is control when the light is turned on and trigger Insight. That's what the control is. It's just turning on the light and triggering Insight. So let's take a look at that flow of SurfaceFX. So it all starts with an input trigger. Now this input trigger would be from a photo eye on the line. It could be from the PLC, but basically this is your start. This is, okay, start acquiring those 4 images that I want. And that's where your light and control comes in. This is where the your light and your external controller or an internal controller, this is where they're going to do their thing. Input trigger is going to say go. This is going to trigger, it's going to acquire, and turn on each quadrant of light. Now once you have that, you have all those images, you have 4 images, you're going to take that and actually pass that to SurfaceFX. Actually, you're going to be passing a region of that image to SurfaceFX. Now you can use the full region, or excuse me, you can use the full image if you want. Just keep in mind that that's going to increase your tool time. Just like all the other tools, you put a bigger region in, it's going to take longer to process. So all the examples that we saw before, they're actually just using a small region. Now if you use a small region, SurfaceFX will run in 5 milliseconds. And if you use a full 2 megapixel image, that could run as much as 150 milliseconds. So my recommendation is just run SurfaceFX on the region or the area that you care about. You don't have to run it on the entire thing. All right, so you get those 4 images, those 4 regions. You're going to pass those to SurfaceFX. SurfaceFX is going to work its magic, and it's going to give you an output image. Now you can use that output image as an input to other tools. For example, you can input that into OCR, into Data Matrix, into Blob. So you can use that image for that. And if you have other things to do outside of SurfaceFX, you can use any of the images that you see. You can use a SurfaceFX image. You can use an image from the left, the top, the right, the bottom. Maybe the light on the top really highlights an edge that you want to inspect. You can use that image for that. Maybe you also want to do another inspection, but there is a lot of reflection on the image itself. You can combine the 4 images and remove the reflection on that. So just keep in mind, when you are doing a SurfaceFX application, you are not limited to only the SurfaceFX image. You have all these other images. All of our tools have an image input, so you can choose any image you want and put that into a tool. Now the next topic I want to talk about is implementation of SurfaceFX in Insight. Now Insight links the spreadsheet with the acquisition. So as you'd imagine, if I wanted to do 4 acquisitions really quick, I need to make sure nothing else is going on with the spreadsheet. This is where we need to add logic. So what we want to do is make sure that Insight is just concentrating on acquiring, and after it's done acquiring, then I want to do everything else that's on my spreadsheet. But since, like I said, Insight, acquisition, and the spreadsheet are linked together, we have to add a little bit of logic in there to make sure that Insight can do the acquisition. And then once it's done with the acquisition, run everything on the spreadsheet. So I was trying to think how to characterize this with Insight. And I came up with the 2 things. So Insight as a master, meaning that Insight will self-trigger itself 4 times. It just needs a signal from the outside world to go. And this could be a photo eye that says, okay, the part is underneath, do your thing. So Insight as a master will get that input trigger, and it will self-trigger itself 4 times, and it will also trigger that light 4 times. So that's what a master would be. Now an Insight as a slave, this is where the external controller comes into play. So again, that CCS controller, the guard is soft, things like that. Insight is just going to react to an input trigger and just count up to 4. Basically, it's going to say, okay, input trigger 1, all right, I'm going to take an image. Input trigger 2, all right, I'm going to take an image. So everything is really done by this controller. The controller controls the light, and it also controls Insight. So I thought I could categorize that as the slave and external trigger. So let's start off with talking about Insight as the master. So again, remembering that flow, we need an input trigger to start the sequence. There's spreadsheet logic to self-trigger itself 4 times. It's going to save those 4 images, and once that's done, it's going to take those 4 images and it's going to pass that to SurfaceFX. And again, after that, you can use that image for OCR, or you can use any number of those images that are there. Now, when you're controlling an external light with the master, with Insight as the master, you can control the light with a CIO micro or a built-in IO, because to turn on an external light would be a discrete output. Turn the discrete output on or off. All right, and Insight will take care of that. Insight will turn on each discrete output depending upon which light should be on at that time. Now, as I mentioned before, you can also use the internal light, and all this control is on the spreadsheet. There's no external I/O because the system is self-contained with that internal light. So I'm speaking specifically about the Insight 7000 Gen 2 with the new internal light. All that's going to be on the spreadsheet. There's no external I/O. The only thing you need to do is tell the system when to go. Now let's talk about Insight as a slave. Again, this is when I mentioned that you're going to be using an external controller, and the external controller is basically going to control Insight and control the light. So as opposed to an input trigger going to Insight, the input trigger is going to go to controller. The controller is going to start the sequence. Insight is just there to take that image and run the algorithm, right? So if you recall with the CCS controller that we first started out with, the trigger would go into the controller to start the sequence, and then it would trigger Insight and turn on each light in sequence. So again, Insight would do its thing. It would save each image, and when it had up to 4 images, it counts 1, 2, 3, 4. Once it gets that, it's going to take that and shove that into SurfaceFX. Now, when you're using an external light, you can control this, as I said, with a light control box, so CCS control box, or a Gardasoft. I mean, that's really what they do, is they control lights. You have the option of a PLC as well. So this external source is going to be the one that is going to, again, control the light and control Insight. So hopefully that makes sense. I put together a little summary here, so hopefully this makes a bit more sense. So Insight is a master, and again, master self-triggering. Insight is a slave, it just does what it's told. So Insight is a master. Again, the integrated light on the 7000 Gen 2 works really well. It's a beautiful demo. But if the integrated light doesn't work, we know we need an external light, so we can use an external light with a CIO micro, and that works on all the next gen models that you see here. Or you can use the external light with the built-in I/O. Again, the 7000 Gen 2 is the only one that has built-in I/O that can get you 4. Alright, but if we can't use the built-in, if we can't use the master, that's okay. We have Insight as a slave. You have Insight with the CCS, external light with that controller, or any other lighting vendor with their controller. You have the external light with a Gardasoft controller. Again, this supports all the new models, okay? Or you have the external light and a PLC controller, but basically they're going to do the same thing. The controller is going to trigger Insight and turn on a light. So let's talk about lighting for a little bit. So the lighting, as I mentioned before, is low angle. You saw from that graph from the that diagram from the beginning, that it's just a low angle directional lighting, and that's what we need. It can be bright field or dark field. What you need to do, the name of this game, is to create the reflections and shadows so they can bounce off those surface features. One way to do this is we can use angled bar lights in a quadrant bracket. CCS has some brackets that are already made that you can use, which are really useful. I know SVL has some additional brackets as well. And then on the very bottom, you see the CCS with their quadrant-controlled light that we have used in the past. The other option is your diffuse on-axis. What I'm talking about here is the integrated light on the 7000 Gen 2, which has some light scattering effects, and it does work really well on in a limited field of view. So I think you have to be about 3 to 5 inches from the part, but your field of view is going to be tiny. But you can use it. And again, it gives you those low-angle effects that's going to hit the product or hit the feature that's either lower or raised from that surface and create those wonderful shadows and reflections that SurfaceFX needs. Now, if we look in the property sheet for SurfaceFX, you're going to see it needs these images in a specific manner. So we see right, bottom, left, top. That is the way the images need to be passed in there. And when you pass them in there like that, you're going to notice that the things that are raised, the features that are raised, are going to be white, and the features that are indented are going to be black. So just make sure that we know how we're acquiring those images and what those images look like so we can pass them into SurfaceFX to do its thing. Camera alignment is something we need to consider. So again, when we're using external lights, again, I just want a low angle light. That's what you need to give me. We need to make sure that when it is directional, it truly is directional. It really does have to come from the left and not the top left. If that makes sense. It has to come from the top, not the top right. It's really got to be coming from those directions. So we just need to be mindful of that when we're setting this up. And while we're here talking about the property sheet and the inputs to SurfaceFX, I just want to briefly go over what the 3 parameters of SurfaceFX do mean. This is actually in the help file because this is officially released in 5.4, so you can always reference that as well. But we have Sigma, which is similar to a smoothing filter. It's going to remove some of the background noise from the SurfaceFX image. And some of the samples you saw, some of the background was also high and low, so there's some texture to that background. And what Sigma will do is minimize some of that texture. So you have a value of 0 to 10 smoothing effects, I guess, if you want to call it that, that can remove some of that background texture and just give you the features that you want. And then brightness, that's going to be, think of this as, what do you want the background color, to be? What do you want that surface to be? Do you want it to be white, which would be 255, or black, which would be 0? Typically I set it to 128, which is right in the middle, but you can obviously adjust that. And then contrast, you can think of this as, what is the feature difference from the background color? So if your feature is raised, it's going to be white. So if your background, your brightness is set to 255 and the feature is white, we want to have some more contrast there. So what we want to do is set your brightness maybe down to 0 and then set your contrast up to 100 to make sure that contrast between the background and that raised feature is really sharp. Alright, the next thing I want to do is go over some setup examples. So we have Insight set up as the master, and we have a few examples with that, along with the sample jobs. And then we have Insight set up as the slave. So what we want to do is just review the Insight master and go over some sample examples. I wanted to show you the spreadsheet, what this job looks like in this spreadsheet. And before you think, okay, where do I get all these jobs are going to be on the support site. They'll be on internal sites for you to reference. And also any sort of, for our channel partners, there's going to be, there's a section that they can get all the SurfaceFX information under the marketing information there. So we're going to make sure that you guys are armed with these jobs. So just keep in mind you will get them. So when we're looking at them, you don't have to worry about that. All right. So let's start off with Insight as the master. Again, we're going to use the Insight 7802 with the integrated lighting, and it's going to self-trigger itself 4 times. And it can do that because this integrated light has bank control. And it's going to do the same thing it did before. It's going to store those images, and once it gets the 4th image, it's going to take those 4 images and run them into SurfaceFX. And as I mentioned before, the working distance on this is about 3 to 5 inches. It really depends on the part that you're looking at. I've had a few people get this up to 8 inches, but this seems to be a nice sweet spot. You can even go a little bit lower there. And again, what's the name of the game? You want to make sure you're getting some nice low angle rays in there that bounce off of those features. So let's take a look at this job. So first I'm going to have my Insight Explorer over here, and I'm just running the emulator. And we are looking at the master, and we are looking at using the integrated light. So let's take a look at that job. I'm going to drag that in here. And one thing to notice here is, do I say the job? Yes, I do. So SurfaceFX sample internal light job. Okay. So this is a very, very simple job that I put together that I wanted you to see the flow. So when it's triggering itself, basically what am I doing? I'm counting the acquisition. And based upon that acquisition number, I take it out of the whatever input mode we have. Let's just say it's manual or camera mode. I take it out of that mode, and then I will trigger the camera automatically based upon that image counter. So you'll see I have a set event based upon 5, and 5 basically says, okay, A5 says, if this count is 0, which means I'm done, put it back to, or don't trigger anymore. But if it's not 0, it's greater than that, make sure you trigger. But that's essentially all I'm doing. Is right here. I'm just counting up the triggers, and I'm self-triggering myself with a set event and a manual trigger capturing that set event. This is an error because I'm using an emulator. Obviously, emulators don't have the light installed, so just ignore that piece. But what am I doing with each trigger here, each image counter here? I'm enabling and disabling each of these filter tools. And these filter tools are, this is just a clip filter. It's set from 0 to 255, so basically it doesn't do anything, but it is a good way to store the images. You have seen this with Latch, but when you have a Latch image, it typically saves that image with the job, and it becomes just a ginormous job. This is a bit more elegant, if you want to think of it that way. We'll just save the image right here, and it doesn't blow up the size of your job. So again, I am disabling and enabling based upon that count. And every time I count, I actually enable each bank. So I know which bank is on with each count. So I know the order that these should be when going into SurfaceFX. And of course it's error because I don't have any new images in there. Okay, but when you run it, you're not going to have this issue. So I have very, very little here for user input. Clearly this is not a demo. This is just to show you exactly what I'm doing. So my user input, you can select your trigger type, whatever it is, camera, external, you triggering from a PLC, doesn't matter. I still need that start sequence. It tells me to go and trigger 4 times. You know, we have the exposure, which is pretty typical. We have my SurfaceFX region. As I said before, you can use the entire thing if you wanted to, but it's going to take longer. So it's what I would recommend is that you just run SurfaceFX on the region that you want to really get that effect on. And here's my button for manual start, and obviously because I'm in, what do you call it, emulator, it's not really going to do anything. But this is where all these images, once it gets to here, it's going to shove all those into my SurfaceFX function. And then after my acquisition is complete, as I said before, then I want to run everything in the spreadsheet. And basically you can enable everything on the spreadsheet based upon this logic right here. Okay. So again, this is when Insight Master, which is self-trigger, based on an external input. Again, this is your photo eye, your button, your PLC, whatever you want. Something just to tell it to go. And the snippet will internally trigger itself. It will internally turn on each bank of that integrated light, and it will save each image based upon what number in the sequence it is, and it will send that to SurfaceFX. So there's the magic of the Generation 2 with the integrated light SurfaceFX. Our next sample is Generation 2 with external lights, but I'm going to use built-in I/O. So I just need the light and I just need the Insight for this. Again, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to trigger itself 4 times. I still need something to say start, and once it starts, then I'll start to enable these 4 discrete outputs. Oops. And as I said before, the Gen 2 has 2 high-speed outputs and 2 bidirectional lines, and we can take those 2 bidirectional lines and turn them into outputs for us. Now you may say, hey, I want those outputs for something else. At that point, you can get an I/O module for that. You can add to your I/O by adding an I/O module if you need something else. But let's take a look at SurfaceFX with built-in I/O. So let me go to my master spreadsheet here, built-in I/O, and here we go. Here's this job. It's going to look very similar to our last job here, except this time, as opposed to turning banks on and off, I'm going to be turning on and off discrete outputs. And each discrete output corresponds to each image or each direction of the light. I know which direction the light is coming from. Therefore, I put these this way. You can rearrange them as your light works. Same thing, I'm counting up to 4. The difference here is I need something to tell me to start. So I'm counting actually up to 5. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5. So once I get that, again, I'm looking at the count, I'm self-triggering myself, and I'm writing a discrete output based upon what light is turned on. So it's a little bit different. And if you notice this here, I have a sleep. I have this in here just for testing purposes only. So what I usually do is I usually put this up to like 2000, and then I turn on each light so I know which one turns on which, and then I quickly write that down here. So you don't need that for this one, but I just have that in there just for testing. But it looks very, very similar. Same thing. Here's my logic. I'm self-triggering myself. I'm turning on discrete outputs. Here's my image storage. Basically, I turn this on and off based upon what count I'm on. My very slim user inputs, and then again, all these images are put into SurfaceFX, and then you can run the rest of the spreadsheet based upon this once you're done. Our next example is SurfaceFX with an Insight Master and talking to a CIO Micro. Now you can also use a CIO 1400, that's what that star is, but the job I have is just created with a CIO Micro. But again, you're just enabling and disabling discrete I/O, so nothing stops you from the 1400. Again, it's a master. This self-triggers itself. And what I have is I have my external light connected to my CIO Micro. And again, because there are so many different varieties of lights, you need to understand how to hook this up to the CIO Micro. But it's 24 volts, you know, I think it's maybe 1 or 2 amps. So that's a lot of the lights can be supported this way, especially if you're just supporting one bank. So the CIO Micro here, we have connected up to, for example, 4-bar lights. that we have here. Okay, same thing. It's going to store the images. It's going to enable them, disable them. Now the working distance depends on the light. Your field of view is going to depend on the light. Just really the sky's the limit about what type of light you need. But again, what are the effects we need? Low angle, directional lighting, ×4. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. I'm going to run this example first. So let me find that example. Use CIO Micro, and this guy's one we want. I don't know why I can't pull that over. I selected the wrong thing. There we go. Again, looks very similar, right? Same thing. I am counting up to 4. I am self-triggering myself, and I'm writing discrete output based upon that. It looks very, very similar to the built-in, all right? Except the only difference is I'm using the CIO Micro, okay? Same thing. I do have a sleep in here, though. I do have a sleep in here. Now, the reason why I have this in here is because the CIO Micro runs on an RPI rate, so it's going to be updated based upon a cyclic time. So I think by default it's set to 5, but you can set that to 3. So every 3 milliseconds, the CIO Micro is updated. It's very, very similar. It's pretty similar to a PLC. It has that RPI rate. So that's why I have this sleep in here. I find that if I just set this to 5, that is enough to allow the light to turn on and allow me to acquire that image at that time. But depending upon the on time for your light, you may need to increase that. So you just need to check that out and play around with that time. But I usually set the CIO Micro to an RPI rate of 3 milliseconds, and it works quite well. Again, same thing. Storage, image logic is stored there. I kind of did my cheat sheet here so I know which one works with what light. I put that all into my SurfaceFX, and again, once SurfaceFX has all that, I enable the rest of my spreadsheet based upon this logic. So you see there's 2 jobs for this. Mine is very, very simple. There is another job which one of our AEs created, which allows you to see much more, and it gives you timing information. So a lot more information in there. But if you just want to see the bare bones, how to get this to work, you can use this example and develop your own. But this is just how I did it, and it works quite well. All right, moving on from the Insight Master to the Insight Slave. Again, the Insight Slave, Insight just responds to the triggers that are coming in. So the trigger that tells it to start, maybe your photo Y on the assembly line, this is going to go to your controller. This is going to go to your CCS controller, your SVL controller, your PLC, your Gardasoft controller. That start signal is going to go to that controller, and then that controller is going to turn around and say Insight trigger, Insight trigger, Insight trigger, and at that time it's going to turn on those lights. So again, same idea. We need 4 of them. Insight's going to store those 4 images based upon a count. And as I said before, because the light is not built in, or the light's not built in, the light is not just one light. There's a wide variety of lights out there. Your working distance is going to depend on that light, and your field of view is going to depend on that light. And for jobs, we have quite a few here. So again, I'm going to start off with mine, which is the simplistic version. So this is my master. Let's go to the slave. And again, I'm just going to run mine, and you can take a look at all the other ones that you need. Aha! So you can see, because this is a slave, I don't need any of that logic. Insight is just going to be externally triggered 4 times. I'm just going to count, right? And then once I get those 4 images, once they're updated, I'm going to take that again, and I'm going to put that into SurfaceFX, and I'm going to enable the rest of the tools based upon that value. All right, so the simpler version to set up would be to have an external controller. All right, so just Insight just responds to those 4. And there's a few different ways to do it. Again, this guy right here, this SFX_Rev07 has a lot more features that you can take a look at. It enables you to display each image, so that, you know, each image from each direction. I believe there's a way you can change it and update it so it just it can take another image where all the lights are on. So there's a lot more functionality in this one. I really wanted to show you guys just the basics, how to get this to work and get you the information and the data that you need really quick. All right, so you can always start here and then improve it. Okay. As I said before, these jobs can be used with any external controller. You're not limited to the CCS. You can use them on any controller. Now the next thing to add is, hey, what about motion? What do we do with motion? So any of these jobs can be used with motion. We just need to add that in there. But how do we do that? So what I want to do first is I want to show you guys a video of motion. So I'm going to be using this job right here, which you will have access to, and this job is using the 7802 with the CCS external controller. So let's take a look at that. Oops. Here we go. And as we can see, what we're doing is we have trained on this pattern right here, and as this pattern goes across the field of view, we're going to move our SurfaceFX region across the field of view just like this pattern moves. And as you can imagine, you can see how wide this is. This isn't going to work with an integrated light, obviously, because this is much larger than 1 to 2 inches. So that's why we have this bar light here that you see here. This is a CCS bar light going into that CCS controller. And then we have our 7802, and it's just using a C-mount lens there. So let's see this in action. As we turn it on, we can see that update as it goes across, and there's two things. And here's the SurfaceFX region. Again, it's a smaller region. If we look over here, our SurfaceFX region is taking about 6 milliseconds. Keep in mind the acquisition to acquire times 4 is 36, so your total time is going to be about 42. So again, I think he sped it up. As you can see, it's going a bit faster. But essentially what he's doing is he trained the pattern, and he set up SurfaceFX with it. And we're going to go through the flow in a second, but this is just one example. And you will have access to this job to take a look at. Okay. So let's close this down and move this out of the way. There was another video that someone else created. So basically they took the SurfaceFX demo job that was out before, and when you see it you'll recognize it. There we go. There's a SurfaceFX demo job. And what they did is they just modified it a bit to handle motion or static. And again, they trained their pattern region. Again, this is a nice credit card. And they're training on the Visa feature here, but only the SurfaceFX is just run here. Very, very quick, because that's all we need. That's all we care about. I don't care about anything else in this field of view except right here. So they have the pattern region set up. They're going to train that again. Train the pattern. And then they're going to make sure that the region for SurfaceFX is set up, which it is. And they're going to trigger. And there we go. I think there's just a little lag, so they were able to trigger it. They're also going to save the image, so now they can pull this up and show you that each image was saved and each image is from a different region. So there's 1 region, 2, 3, and you can see it's moving. So it wasn't very apparent that it was moving, but it was moving. So there's that example. So you're going to have access to both of these jobs as well, so you can take a peek at how they did that. So let's talk about how they did that. By adding motion. So you can add motion to any job. So what do they do? Number one is you need to train your pattern. You need to train that what feature are you looking at to fixture your SurfaceFX region to. One thing we found is if you train all 4 of the lights, so if you train each light, each pattern with the light effect, it seems to really help, especially if you have a lot of motion with the crest example. It really helps to train 4 patterns, each with the 4 different light effects on your target part. But if you saw if there is little motion, you really don't need to do that. You can just use just the one. Again, all starts with an input trigger, something to say go. Assembly line, the part is in place. Go ahead and run your acquisition sequence, which is left, top, right, bottom, really, really quick. So it's going to do that. It's going to turn on the light, and it's going to acquire, and it's going to save those images. So once those images are saved, now you can run your pattern location tool, your Redline pattern location tool or PatMax pattern location tool on each image. And once you know where that is, what you can do is actually adjust that region that's going to pass into SurfaceFX. You can adjust that with scale image and fixture that with your pattern location so that SurfaceFX gets, basically it looks like the same image, like it doesn't look like there's any motion. So SurfaceFX doesn't see that motion. It just sees 4 images with the pattern or with the effects that I want that I'm going to use in order to extract the features that I want. And again, after you do that in scale image, you're going to pass the scale image to SurfaceFX, and SurfaceFX is going to give you that image that you want. So to summarize everything that we are talking about with SurfaceFX, I first wanted to start off with just the overall solutions with this. So again, number one, we have the compact SurfaceFX solution. This is with the Gen 2 with the integrated lights. There's no controllers, no I/O. It self-triggers, and it is a fantastic demo. It's really great to show what SurfaceFX can do. Why would you use it? But in terms of real application setups, keep in mind the field of view is small. That's all. It's probably not going to be good for motion again because your field of view is so tiny. But if you do install this on an application, please let me know because I'd love to see that. But it is just fantastic for a demo. Now, if you're going to be using an external light, this is really the flexibility message that we want to convey. That SurfaceFX and Insight is flexible because you're not looking at a similar part. I mean, you're going to look at parts that are very, very small, all the way up to parts that are ginormous, maybe the size of a car door. And there is no light family that can support that range. So you really got to open up the supportive light. So any light out there that you can find that's going to give you a nice low angle, any light that's going to give you 4 distinct quadrants of that, that's really what we want. And there's a lot of lights out there that can do that. In terms of controlling, again, what do you need the control for? You need to trigger and you need to have that light on at the same time so you get those 4 images, right? So you can use what's already on the line. There's a PLC on the line. Use the PLC to trigger the light and trigger the camera. Insight would be a slave at this point, right? Now, if you don't want to use a PLC, that's perfectly fine. You can use an external controller. For example, a CIO Micro would double as a PoE injector. And you can also control the 8000 as well. So the CIO Micro is a great solution that you could use. Again, the light vendors have light controllers that you can use. You know, SVL, OPT, CCS, they all have these light controllers that you can use, again, to control their lights. And just send maybe a signal to Insight or send a signal to Insight. So check out those controllers. And then you have Gardasoft. Gardasoft is built for controlling lights. So definitely take a look at them as well in your solution when you're taking a look at this. And then finally, we have the built-in I/O. And again, as I said, if you're not using an external I/O module like the CIO Micro or the 1400, you can use the Gen 2 with 4 discrete outputs to control your light. And just keep in mind that you're building your own lighting solution for the application you have, whether it's small, whether it's large. Again, you need low angle, directional lighting. That's what you need. And you need to make sure you trigger Insight and turn on each quadrant, okay? And Insight's always going to be a master or a slave. Insight can self-trigger itself based upon an input go signal, or Insight can just respond to what it's told, so it can trigger 4 times. All these jobs that you saw today, I have available. They will be available to you on the support site. Tech support will have these. They will also be available internally and also available for our channel partners as well. On the marketing page, you'll see a SurfaceFX marketing page, the marketing downloads that they can get. So you're going to have all these jobs available to you so you can take a look at and start off with, and then you can configure your own. Next, I just want to summarize some of the things we covered with SurfaceFX, things to keep in mind when you're setting this up. So SurfaceFX needs 4 images from 4 distinct quadrants to run properly. Dark field lighting Low angle lighting, that's really what we want. You can use dark field or bright field. Again, the name of this game is to create shadows and reflections, all right? One thing we have noticed is that darker images, the lower exposure, perform better with this algorithm. And there's no perfect answer for light placement. You can start with dark field, then move to bright field and see what you get in terms of the result from SurfaceFX. Again, we want something that can give us shadows and reflections off of those features that are indented or raised. When Insight's in slave mode, again, Insight just triggers based upon an external input. Again, you're not limited to the CCS controller and CCS Lite. We did start off with that, but there's a lot more out there. Like I said, Gardasoft, CIO Micro, the PLC, the CIO 1400. These are all great external controllers, and it really depends on your application, which one works best for what you're trying to set up. So when you're using an external light, things to keep in mind is the camera alignment is key. Camera to light alignment is key. We want to make sure that each light comes in from the quadrant it's supposed to. We want to make sure it's coming in straight right, the bottom, the left, and the top. We don't want anything in the corners. Try to minimize that if you can, right? And again, as I mentioned, those 4 acquired images are not limited to SurfaceFX. So you have the top, the bottom, right, and left. Yes, those go into SurfaceFX, or the regions that are based off of those images go into SurfaceFX, but you can use those 4 images for other things, like for reflection removal. You can use image math to do that, or perhaps if the top image of the light coming in from the top really highlights a feature that you need to inspect, then use that image. All of our tools have input image parameters, so you can use any of those to complete your inspection. So your inspection doesn't have to be just SurfaceFX. As I mentioned before, again, we want to enable the tools after the image acquisition because Insight marries the acquisition in spreadsheet. That's why we add logic to allow Insight to just do the acquisition part, and when you're done, enable the rest of your tools based upon that one logic bit that we saw. Okay, so don't run tools while it's doing the image acquisition because that's just going to delay, and you're going to add delay in your overall time. Speaking of time, the SurfaceFX tool time is based upon the size of the input region. As you saw with our examples, the region is pretty small. It's really localized around the area that I care about. So the OCR characters, for example, that's the area I care about, and that's the area I want. And when it's smaller, it's going to run faster. So your surface of tool time will be, it could be 5 milliseconds. In addition to the 4 acquires, you have to keep that in mind. You got 4 acquires in there too. But if you do the entire region, maybe you're inspecting the entire region, and that is okay. So if you do an entire 2 megapixel region, for example, your SurfaceFX tool time will increase, and what I've seen is maybe 100 to 150. Again, it's just a lot more data for it to process. And as you saw, that SurfaceFX is in the spreadsheet. It's not an Easy Builder. I have seen one customer use Tool Builder to add this to Easy Builder, so that's a nice value add for them that they took this and put this in Easy Builder. But all the SurfaceFX is in the spreadsheet. If you have any questions or you don't remember some of those SurfaceFX parameters, this is officially supported, so it is in the help document, so definitely check those out if you have questions. As I mentioned before, the SurfaceFX job files are found on the Cognex support site. Now I've categorized them as master, self-trigger, or slave, where just everything, your external controller will trigger Insight. And inside each master and slave category, for example, if you set up the built-in, I put a PDF in there as well to instruct you how to set this up with some external things. So, for example, I have this master folder here that you see. What will happen is I'll probably zip all these together. So if I'm using the CIO Micro, here's a few different jobs you can use, and here is a PDF that will tell you how to set this up. A little bit of setup, how to test it, how to deploy it, and an example setup. 2 example setups for you. One's using SVL, one was using the CCS. So that is available to you to reference. And I put this together just as a summary so you understand. Again, Insight Master self-triggers itself. You can use this with the integrated lights. You can use this with the CIO Micro or the built-in I/O and external light. And Insight as a slave, you're using an external light and you're using an external controller, and basically that controller controls the light and Insight. So that is all I have for you for SurfaceFX. So hopefully this cleared up a few things, got you interested in taking a look at these jobs and maybe improving them, making them work for your applications. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you, and thank you for listening.